Hello, my name is Phoebe Parker Shames, and I'm a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. My dissertation takes an interdisciplinary approach to studying the ecological outcomes of cannabis legalization. Today, I'll be sharing results from a monitoring study entitled Coexisting with Cannabis: Wildlife Response to Marijuana Cultivation in the Klamath-Siskiyou Ecoregion. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Wenjing Zhu, Lindsay Rich, and Justin Bracheres. All the results I'm about to present have been accepted for the upcoming CDFW California Fish and Wildlife Journal special issue on cannabis. And that's coming out later this summer, so if you want more details on what's presented here, please keep an eye out for that. With waves of recreational marijuana legalization, especially in the West, we have seen a rapid rise of the cannabis industry, which has provided researchers with an opportunity to study the intersections of policy and rapid land use change. However, as the industry goes through its growing pains, what cannabis production looks like can be quite varied. Here we see examples of trespass production on public lands, small-scale outdoor farming, mixed light greenhouse production, and industrial-scale indoor production. There are actually many gradations between these types, but they can each have vastly different ecological impacts. From a conservation perspective, there's been a large focus on public land trespass sites and their environmental impact, and relatively less on the other forms of production. However, there is some evidence to suggest that public land production is decreasing with legalization. This means there is an opportunity to shape what replaces this production source. Managers, policymakers, and conservationists can draw on different development frameworks, like land sparing, land sharing, to balance production and ecological outcomes. However, to make these decisions, we need better information on how wildlife interact with cannabis production and possibilities for cannabis-wildlife coexistence. Today, I am focusing on outdoor private land production, as it is the style of cannabis farming that is most likely to have a direct interface with wildlife after trespass production. As a note, I am grouping both licensed and unlicensed production in these analyses due to similarities in production practices and ultimately difficulty distinguishing legal or illegal production in a system that is full of gray areas, especially during the early stages of legalization. But in general, these farms tend to be small scale, located in rural areas, and that provide an opportunity for human-wildlife interface, which in turn enables us to ask questions about wildlife response. So this brings me to my research question. How does private land cannabis cultivation interface with wildlife communities on and surrounding outdoor cannabis farms? In other words, could this form of development increase or decrease wildlife detections on site? Does cannabis production have similar outcomes as other forms of rural development in its ability to alter the wildlife that coexists with it? To address this research question, I situated this study in a biodiverse region with recently legalized cannabis production. So, welcome to the Klamath-Siskiyou Ecoregion. It spans the Oregon-California border and is a major biodiversity hotspot in North America, with areas identified as critical climate change refugia. The area is the ancestral home of the Cow Creek Umpqua, Tolowa Dene, Tequilma, Karuk, Shasta, Chetco, and Yurok people. Specifically, my study sites were located in Josephine County, Oregon. Oregon had its first recreational legal cannabis growing season in 2016, and Josephine County has the highest per capita recreational cannabis licenses in the state. So because of privacy agreements with the farmers who participated in the study, I'm not going to show you exact locations, but the 8 farms that I used for this study were clustered in 3 regions. These are watersheds that correspond loosely to the areas around Wilderville, Selma, and Cave Junction. These farmers graciously agreed to let me place cameras on their farms, so I want to give a huge thank you to them. The cameras I used looked like this in the corner. I had unbaited cameras set on the 8 farms and rotated comparison cameras that were not on cannabis, but were within 500 meters of the farm. And I used this data to create descriptive summaries of wildlife detection rates on and nearby cannabis farms. And then I selected the top 3 wildlife species with the most detections and ran single species occupancy models to look at the associations of presence and detection with cannabis farms. In this case, since the data is fairly fine scale, I want to explain a little bit about how we're interpreting the occupancy results and what variables we included in model selection. Because we were using an occupancy modeling framework primarily to look at the associations of wildlife with candidate variables, we defined detection, as in Latif et al. 2016, as the probability that a species would be detected given they were present, as influenced by both availability and perceptibility. Perceptibility in this case means that it is influenced by fine-scale space use and behavior. Candidate variables were a binary on or off cannabis farm, distance to road, and year. We defined occupancy as space use for this fine-scale analysis, represented by occupancy and availability. Candidate variables were cannabis farm, elevation, distance to nearest stream, percent forested land cover within 1 kilometer, and the watershed scale grouping. We modeled detection first and used AIC to evaluate model selection before then modeling occupancy. Today, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to focus on the detection results as better able to indicate avoidance at a fine scale. But first, let me give you a sense for what we found for the overall detections. We had over 5,000 animal detections across 957 trap nights from 2018 to 2019. We recorded 18 species on cannabis farms and 24 on comparison sites. Obviously, just detecting an animal on a camera doesn't necessarily tell us how animals are using those spaces, but we can get a qualitative sense of that by looking at the photos themselves. We documented several photos that seem to indicate animals not just passing through cannabis farms, but spending time on site and potentially even using them as spaces to gather food. For example, this bear rummaging at the base of a cannabis planter, or this rabbit eating grass in between cannabis rows, or this coyote carrying what I think is a fawn through the middle of a farm. However, some of these species or individuals may be exceptions rather than the rule. When we look at the detection rate by species on cannabis and comparison sites, we see slightly different wildlife communities. The x-axis on this graph are the most commonly detected species, excluding humans, which had the highest detection rate on both cannabis and comparison cameras. And the y-axis is detections per 100 trap nights. Let me highlight a few specific differences we see. First, not surprisingly, domestic dogs and cats were detected more on cannabis farms, shown here as the lighter gray bars. While conversely, wild predators were generally detected more on comparison sites, the darker black bars. I will note that for our rarest carnivores, this association is less clear. For mountain lions, we had only 7 detections on cannabis farms and only 1 on a comparison site, while bobcats were split evenly with 2 detections on each. And then finally, large-bodied wildlife such as deer, coyotes, and bear were detected more on comparison sites. So now let's focus in on the single species models. We used the top 3 most detected wildlife species for these analyses: black-tailed deer, lagomorphs, and gray foxes. And this detection graph already gives us a bit of a hint as to what the modeling results show. Focusing on the detection results, Cannabis Farm had a negative association with detection for black-tailed deer and gray foxes, but not for lagomorphs. Let me give a little more detail about what that looks like. This is a visual guide to the top model for detection results, indicating which variables were selected for which species, the direction, and the strength of those associations. So we see that cannabis had a negative association for both deer and gray fox detections, but not for rabbits. Year was somewhat inconsistent, and distance to roads was consistently and positively associated with detection for all 3 species. Now, remember that these detection results were influenced both by an animal's actual occupancy as well as perceptibility. So when we interpret the cannabis results, this may indicate a few different things. Animals may become more secretive on site, which makes them less likely to be detected. Or they may be physically blocked by fencing, or they may be avoiding the cannabis farm altogether. The reasons behind these changes in detection may be species specific, but we are beginning to get a sense of the type of response wildlife have to these sites, which lets us draw a few conclusions. First, wildlife are consistently present on and around cannabis farms. We see this from the detection rate results and the general list of species documented. Second, private land cannabis production may influence the local space use of some species more than others, which we learned from the modeling data. Finally, cannabis farms may deter larger-bodied wildlife species in particular. We see this not only from the detection rate comparisons, but also when we look at the different response of deer and foxes compared to the smaller lagomorphs. These data present a preliminary baseline of understanding that can help us direct further research and conservation. For example, one of the big outstanding questions for interpreting these results is what the presence of wildlife on private land cannabis farms means. We did not find that cannabis farms are devoid of animal life, and nor did we find any evidence that they are attracting animals. What we don't know is what happens to the animals that do find a way to overlap with this form of agriculture. Depending on part on what happens as a result of animals like this deer using and sharing space with cannabis, there is a potential for cannabis agriculture to follow the route of small-scale land-sharing farming and maintaining biodiversity. However, a lot more information is needed about site-level practices on farms, such as fencing, lighting, and other forms of disturbance, and their influence on wildlife, particularly for those species that avoid these sites. Ultimately, we may be able to use other forms of rural development as a guide for conservation recommendations with cannabis. So with that, I'd like to give a big thank you to my undergraduate research assistants, my lab, my dissertation committee, and the Cannabis Research Center at Berkeley. Thank you for watching, and please get in touch with any questions you may have.